Good morning, everyone. Top management has asked us, the supervisory staff, to talk to you about our production schedule and some changes that certain events have made necessary. Now, I don't think it's necessary to discuss these events with you since it's really none of your concern. Your job is to increase production. Now, we're going to have to make some scheduling changes that I don't think you're going to like, but that's the breaks. Now, to begin with...
Hi, how you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Say, how did that review of that proposal go when you gave it to our group?
Oh, just fine. They were interested in particular in the analytic method we use to arrive at the data. The whole approach is a relatively new one, and everyone was interested in how it was done.
Well, are you going to change the presentation much for the customer?
Well, why should I? It was obvious that everyone was more interested in the detail rather than the results. I'm going to really emphasize the method now that I know it's of interest.
The Section 23 analysis was based on both the ATR standards and the federal DOP-16 manual produced by AGO. The results of the analysis are detailed in our own CCD-14 report. But today, I just want to touch base on the ANSCAM method we use to determine the MRB of our TR-1100.
These kinds of errors are relatively common in the technical industries. And as a matter of fact, I hope they're not the kinds of things that you do individually. But they're all based on a common fallacy. And that is that you can prepare and deliver a good technical presentation without understanding the characteristics of your audience. I suspect one of the more difficult things to talk about in this entire series of programs is that of audience characteristics. Now, you know from your practical experience that every time you give a technical presentation, you're going to face audiences that are different for every different kind of circumstance. They're made up of individuals frequently who have different levels of technical knowledge, have different concerns, interests, needs, and all the other things that go along with it. So it's kind of hard to pin down what can you say now about an audience before they're formed and gathered as an audience. I think there's some generalizations that can be made about audience characteristics that, if understood, will increase the likelihood that you can make an effective technical presentation. And I think the first kind of general split that we want to make is the difference between the in-house audience, what I suppose must be an out-house audience. I've never figured out that terminology, but let's talk about the in-house audience. That is, that group of individuals who are representing the same corporation that you're representing. The kind of thing that you do on a regular basis, whether they be status reviews, technical updates, whatever. Now, I think in terms of the in-house audience, that you have both advantages and disadvantages. And let's talk about the advantages first. When you make an in-house presentation, one of the things that you can kind of count on is that the audience has a certain level of shared knowledge and shared goals. Now, shared knowledge in the sense that they understand the organizational structure of the company, they understand some of the projects that are involved, they have a real good feel for the jargon associated with the company so that you don't have to worry about all of the shorthand forms we have for talking to people. And they also have a kind of a shared overall goal, which we would assume was to exercise some kind of a profit margin and maintain the job at all costs. But these are the advantages. When you work with that kind of an audience, you can make some assumptions about the overall common ground on which you're operating. But there are disadvantages associated with the in-house audience, and I think they are very important for you to understand. To begin with, when you're making an in-house presentation, you're almost inevitably going to run into some kind of conflict. Now, it is important to recognize that the conflict you're running into is a role conflict. I can recall sitting at a guy's desk and I was just chatting with him, all right? And it was one of these great big open areas, you know, with with a whole bunch of desks out there, and I don't know what we were talking about, but all of a sudden some guy came storming into the area, he had a stack of overheads in his hand, and he slammed him down on the desk, and he said, "He did it to me again." I, reacted to it, and I discovered later that he had been at an internal meeting. That is some kind of a status report or staff report. So I went and talked to him. I said, "Hey, what happened?" And what happened was very simple. He had made his report, and somebody within his own structure was sharpshooting him, all right? Objecting to everything and putting him in the hot seat and all the other things went along with it. Now, the fascinating thing about that is that the guy had literally made it a personal conflict. He said, "He did it to me again." Now, if you get into a personal conflict kind of thinking, then I think you're going to make a serious error. To understand the nature of role conflict, take a look at your org chart. You know, that great big thing that identifies what it is that the corporation is all about. Take a look at the lines of functional relationship that are established. It is common, for instance, in an engineering corporation to see a design function, a manufacturing function, quality control, you have reliability, procurement, and all kinds of lines that go across. Now, when an individual is hired within a company, he is in some way or other placed in one of those little boxes. And the corporation is in essence saying to the individual, "Look, we are going to pay you a salary for doing the best job that you can to fulfill the functions that lie underneath that box." Now, what happens when a design engineer goes in and says, "In my best professional judgment, this is the way we ought to do it"? And then somebody in reliability or quality or procurement sits up and says, "No way, you can't do it that way," and there's the conflict. Now, the conflict is based on each individual attempting to do a job. If you understand that, that makes it a lot easier for you to analyze how to reduce the conflict. It gives you the capability of being able to say, "Wait a minute, what is the other person's approach? What are their standards? What are the concerns that are involved? What kinds of pressures do they face?" Literally, how can I express my message in the other person's language or from their perspective that are going to reduce the amount of conflict between us? That's what I mean by it not being personal, but being a role conflict. Remember that in a professional organization, there's almost an assumption in advance that you're going to agree to disagree. And I think it's there for the very simple reason that any organizational structure literally creates a circumstance like the 5 blind men and an elephant. Everybody's got a little piece of something going on, an understanding of their area. That doesn't mean they understand everybody else's area. Part of what you've got to do is understand the other parts of the elephant and use it as a means of reducing conflict. Now, there's a second area I think that's a disadvantage for the in-house presentation, and that's what we call low ethos. Now, that's a Greek word that goes back to the writings of Aristotle. Aristotle, in writing the book, The Rhetoric, the first solid manual on persuasion, said that there are 3 principal means by which we persuade: logos, pathos, and ethos. D'Artagnan was added later. Small literary joke. Logos, according to Aristotle, meant that if you phrase your arguments in logical form, and if they are credible and believable, then when you get to the conclusion, the audience must necessarily accept your conclusion. Pathos had to do with emotion. That is, you move the audience emotionally. You cry a lot, for instance. Well, it's obvious, isn't it? That's not going to work in the average technical presentation. Ethos had to do with your stature as an individual, your reputation, if you will. That kind of person who is so well known and accepted as an expert that you would not dare question what they're saying. Now, I don't think, again, it takes much analysis to recognize that when you're making an in-house presentation, it is difficult to rely on reputation because you just become another person working for the company. Even the Bible said, you know, the prophet is not without honor except in his own house. For instance, where is a man's ethos at its absolute lowest, by the way, a married man? With his wife. Have you ever tried to convince your wife you're an expert in anything at all? Now, it may not be that familiarity breeds contempt. as much as it is that people begin to work as a team and see themselves in a kind of a peer or a co-relationship. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? For the in-house presentation, if we have only 3 approaches to persuasion, and we know ethos isn't going to do it, we know that pathos isn't going to do it, or dealing with emotion, what are you left with? You're left with logic. Now, I'm going to talk about logic, or logics actually, in much more detail later on. But for now, recognize sometimes your best method of presentation for the in-house presentation is to say, look, this is my professional judgment, this is what I think, and this is why I believe it, and be ready. Somewhere along the line, somebody is going to object to it. But as long as you're able to make everybody understand how you got there, the logic of your own presentation or arguments, you're way ahead in a technical presentation. Now, that's fine for the in-house presentation. I think when we start talking about the out-of-house audience, we run into a different set of problems. Let's talk about what are the characteristics of the out-of-house audience. Now, we talk about the out-of-house audience. I think the simplest way is to make a distinction to start with between kind of the 3 levels of audience with which you might be dealing. That is a management audience, a technical audience, or a non-technical audience. Now, I think a management audience is easiest understood when we go back to the organizational chart again. If you take a look at an org chart again, the old pyramid concept, you can see relative levels within which people are involved. And when you look at the org chart, think in terms of a mountain, by the way, like a peak is sitting up there. The higher you go on the organizational chart, and literally as the higher you go on a mountain, the greater your vision is. That is, you can see out over the whole breadth of what's going on. The higher you go up in the organizational chart, the same thing is true. You're better your perception of the nature of the business. Now, if you're down at the bottom of that chart, and you know, like down at the bottom of a mountain, you don't really have much of a perception of the whole picture. But there's a difference involved. The higher you go, the more you see, but you don't see any detail. Everything begins to fade out on you. When you're down at the bottom, you don't see much, but what you see with absolute clarity. Now, that's the up and down relationship where the management audience is involved. Managers have a view that gives them the broad perspective. The engineer further down in the organizational chart has the responsibility of providing management with the detail, with that kind of narrow perspective that an engineer can have when working on a small part of a large project. By the way, if you're management, then it's the reverse. You need to share, a lot of times with the people who are lower on the organizational chart, the advantage that you have of a broader perspective of what's going on. The up and down relationship is one that is critical to the way in which you deal with the management side of the audience. Now, what about the technical side? Well, I want to define technical audience very narrowly. I mean a technical audience when you're talking about people out there who have the same kind of experience, the same concerns, the same kind of background, the same language level, and everything that you have in your subject matter. This is the kind of thing that you get to at a convention or something like that, where experts, knowledgeable people share ideas or insights or information. And by the way, it's an easy audience to talk to. You can, kind of shorthand form. You talk about the Schlockmeyer effect, and they go, mm-hmm. All right? And you don't have to explain a lot of things. And it gives you tremendous freedom. Now, what about the non-technical audience then? Now, that's a little bit different. A non-technical audience is any audience that doesn't have management responsibility, that doesn't have the same level of experience that you have and everything else, and even though, by the way, they may be experts themselves in some subject matter area other than your own. And one of the best examples I ever saw of this was in a corporation where an engineer, a chemical engineer, had a responsibility of making a presentation. Now, the group to whom he was speaking, by the way, was somewhat varied, but they were all at a high level of engineering expertise. But unfortunately, what he had was a group made up of electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, architectural engineers, civil engineers, nuclear engineers, and he had a few scattering of people involved in accounting, some people who were in sales, some people in services. It was quite a group. Now, that group would be a non-technical audience, because although they have a lot of expertise in various areas, the important thing to remember is they're not technically expert in the subject matter with which the speaker is dealing. Now, this one last thing on this business of the technical level, and that's to talk about language and the importance of language to the nature of your audience. And it has particular impact, by the way, on both the management and on the non-technical audience. One of the problems that I think any expert in any field deals with has what we call the levels of language that we can speak. For instance, we can start at the level of primacy. The level of primacy is your basic native language, whatever it might be. If you want to communicate with the broadest possible spectrum of audience, then you can keep your language level at, or for instance, at a high school level, so that anybody with a high school education can understand. Your vocabulary is not pushed beyond their limits. But you're all involved in some kind of vocation. And your vocation has trained you with a vocabulary that is somewhat specialized, so that people who have not shared that vocational background may not understand the language. Now, we compound it today by specialization within the vocations. And everybody is super specialized today, all right? It's reached the point now where you talk to somebody and they say they're a naval surgeon, you don't know whether to salute or talk about ins and outs. But we all have this kind of specialization. Then we'll compound it one more time. We'll talk about jargon. Jargon, by definition, is nothing more than super specialized language that is designed to communicate within a very small language community. All right, we all have jargon. We have it in my discipline, too, by the way, as well as yours. I remember once I left a faculty meeting at a university early for some reason or other, and later that night I met a colleague of mine at a supermarket, and I stopped him and I said, "Hey, Scott, so what happened after I left the meeting?" And he thought for a moment. He said, "Oh yeah, well," he said, we went on to a discussion of the 3-3 versus the 4-1-4. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry I missed that." He said, "What do you want, by the way?" I said, "Well, I want the 4-1-4. He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I want to teach the 1. He said, "Well, if you like that, why don't we go for a 1-3-1-3-1? I said, "Well, Scott, you never get the first 1 off the ground." Now, the butcher was standing there at this point watching us, back and forth. And finally, since he knew us both, he leaned over and he said, "Excuse me," he said, "do you guys know what you're talking about?" Now, he really didn't need to know what we were talking about, but he wanted to be sure that we knew what we were talking about. Now, we did. Look, 3-3, 4-1-4 is academic jargon having to do with calendar forms. That is, how do you organize the curriculum in reference to semesters or quarters or things like that. For the two of us, it was an efficient method of communication. And any time that you use jargon with someone who understands you, it is very efficient. Just be very cautious about that portion of the audience that does not share an understanding of the jargon. It would be simple, wouldn't it? Though if we could talk about you either have a management audience or a technical audience or a non-technical audience. Unfortunately, what you're going to run into more times than not is what we call a mixed audience. I don't mean a sexually mixed audience. I mean an audience that's got a few management types over here and some technical types and some non-technical types, and they all need to know what's going on. How do you handle it? Well, I've seen it handled both ways, by the way. I've seen people go into a technical presentation knowing their audience and say, "Well, look, I want to talk to the upper management types, the decision makers, and I know they don't understand the jargon," so they go broad brush through an entire presentation. The only problem with that is that the decision maker may be relying upon his technical components to make a judgment about your material. And if you don't give them enough technical information, they have no basis for making a judgment. And go the other way, too. You can say, well, I want to talk to a bunch of managers. I want to talk to the people who really know what's going on. And so you zing it in there with all the nitty-gritties you can lay onto it, and the technical people are all sitting there going, hey, neat. But nobody else knows what's being said. And not only do you irritate them, but you ultimately are going to reach the point where some decision maker is going to rely on personal judgment to make a decision and no grounds for making personal judgment. Now, there's a way off of the, if you will, the horns of this dilemma. You recall earlier we talked about the idea of tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. We were talking about that in the overall structure of a presentation. It also has application for each one of the main ideas of a presentation. But let me rephrase it. When you're presenting technical information, point by point, you begin with a generalization. That is, now this is what is of concern now in this portion of it. All right, right now I would like to discuss the methodology that we use to determine the reliability figures that we have presented in the proposal. Any dum-dum can understand that, even a manager. Now, at that level, they're into the presentation. Now you start moving to the specifics. And you begin to give them the methodology and the detail and the tables and everything else. But occasionally, step back away from the detail and really say, now, what this means is, and move back to a generalization. So what you're doing by moving from the general to the specific and back to the general is you're creating an environment where, yeah, you may cut somebody out of the audience once in a while, but you don't leave them out for very long. You're dealing with all possible levels of understanding to the best of your ability. Now, that kind of audience approach, I think, will give you the maximum amount of capability of reaching your entire audience. At this point, just be aware that management and technical and non-technical characteristics of an audience create a difference that's going to have an impact on the way in which you make your presentation. Now, another way, I think, in which you can classify or categorize audiences is to think in terms of their purpose in sitting in the audience to start with. Because remember, no audience would be in front of you in the making of a technical presentation if there wasn't a reason why they're there. And I think these purposes can be clearly defined to give you a better concept of how you approach it. Now, what do I mean by a purpose? Let me kind of tie it to what your purpose might be in relationship to the audience. One of the most common ones that I run across is literally the purpose of providing the audience with a service. A tremendous number of engineering corporations are now working on what might be called one-of-a-kind type of work. That is, a client or customer comes to them and says, look, we have a need that we cannot fulfill. Therefore, would you do it for us? And now that's providing a service to the customer or to the client. But you notice that the key is always going to be on what is their need. There's a confusion, I think, sometimes that muddies the waters a little bit in technical presentations when people get in front of an audience and talk about what they want to talk about instead of focusing on what does the audience need to hear in order for you to meet your responsibilities of providing a service. Now, there are times, though, when you say, hey, the purpose of giving this presentation is to persuade the audience. That's kind of your perception of what's going on. From an audience point of view, however, you view persuasion from what are the values of the audience and what would motivate them, for instance, to accept your proposal or to go in the direction in which you want them to go. You know, there's an old saying that goes back many, many years. It says, people buy things for their reasons, not for yours. And that, I think, is a key to good persuasion in a technical context. When you go in front of an audience and you say to them, literally, you really ought to want to do this. Now, obviously, there's going to be some benefit for you involved. But if all you're really saying to them is, you really ought to want to do this because I think it would help me out, why should they do it? Now, anytime you're talking persuasion, then you begin by understanding that the audience is characterized by the audience's reasons for agreeing with what you want. All right? Now, we also get into what might loosely be called education or elucidation. It has a lot of terms that are involved in it. The straightforward speech to inform. That is, your role as a technical expert is to go before an audience and explain something that they do not already know and that they need to know for whatever reason. Now, the danger of education is always going to be that you have got to understand what your entry level is. I recall at one point assisting an engineer who was doing some work on fluidics in general. In particular, was going around talking about the potential of applying fluid dynamics instead of electromagnetic dynamics in terms of gyroscopes and things of that nature. Now, he had prepared a rather neat presentation, as a matter of fact, based in part, of course, on his own expertise in the area of fluidics. And just prior to the first major presentation that he was to give in this area, he was discussing late at night with someone else the nature of the audience to whom he was speaking, and made the statement, well, I'm assuming that the audience understands the basic principles of fluidics. And the response of the other individual was, I doubt it. And then he explained the audience was not going to be up to technical level. Now, therein lies the choice. What's he going to do about something like that? Well, I think he made the right choice. He began his presentation the next day very simply by saying...
Thank you very much for that introduction, Mr. Parker.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do appreciate the opportunity to come here today to talk to you about some of the applications that fluidics may have for your particular industry and for the products that you are manufacturing. In putting this presentation together, it became very obvious to me that we're going to face a problem, however, possibly in the area of terminology. It's not that you don't understand the basic terms of fluidics. I know that you do. It's just that I have become more and more aware lately that I have fallen into the habit of using some of these terms in somewhat restricted ways and in many cases somewhat unusual ways. So before I get into the main development that I want to go into today, I'd like to spend a little bit of time defining some of the basic terminology. Now let's take a look at some of the basic terms.
Fluid, in the context within which I'm going to be using it,
whatever the definitions were going to be. Now, at that point, he had a grasp of the entry level of his audience in terms of their technical knowledge. And that entry level was not as high as he had originally anticipated, and he adjusted his message to meet the needs of the people out here. Now, of course, you notice that he did not begin by saying, it has come to my attention that you people are so dumb that you don't understand the basics, therefore I'll go back to them. But this is touchy, and I'll be the first one to admit it, by the way. If you undervalue the level of your audience, then they're going to be ticked off because you're talking down to them. So that characteristic of an audience of what their entry level is going to be a critical one for you. Now let me talk about a final or a fourth kind of a purpose that the audience might have, and that deals with decision making. You're all aware that on a day-by-day basis, managerial types are making decisions constantly. They may be decisions that have to do with the organization of work. They may have decisions to do with the selection of components or engineering design. They could be massive kinds of decisions that relate to where they are going to make large capital investments. Now, what do they use as the basis for making those decisions? Well, I'm assuming that they are done on the basis of what we call a professional judgment. Now, what's a professional judgment? Well, based on your knowledge of whatever it is you're involved in, based upon your experience, you take all of the known data and combine it together, analyze that data, and then extrapolate from that data a decision that would appear on the surface to be the best one given your professional judgment. There's nothing wrong with that. We do it constantly, day by day. But note that the role of data is a critical one. Unless they know, understand, comprehend, and appreciate the detail on which the decision is based, you run an incredibly high potential for a bad decision. So that's where you begin. The expert frequently comes in and merely says, this is what the information is that you need to make a good judgment. But again, that data has got to be presented in a way that is comprehensible to the audience so they have a grasp of it. Now, there might be a second level of data level for decision making. In many cases, decision makers will come to an engineering expert and say, this is what we have at this point decided to do. What are the implications of that decision? That requires that you, based on your experience and your professional capability, analyze that decision in order to determine what its downstream effects are going to be. Now, these are all kind of basic ones, but we could talk purposes all day long. But if you talk in terms of providing a service, in persuading an audience, informing an audience, providing them with the raw data for decision, or providing them with the data necessary to determine the implications of a decision, all of them gear, however, to the needs of the people out here. The single biggest mistake that you can make is to make a technical presentation that is designed to meet your own personal needs. And I don't know how many times I have heard speakers stand in front of an audience and make a technical presentation, and when it's all over, I'll say, how did you think it went? The guy responds, beautiful. I understood every word I said. Now, that's unfortunately all too common. We'll go back to the basics. The audience is the #1 factor that you need to be concerned with. Earlier we talked about the characteristics of the audience as listener. Now we've talked about the audience in terms of how they might be characterized, classified. We have one last step that I think we need to do in terms of the audience itself, and that is, for you as an engineer, how do you go about analyzing the audience? And that's what we're going to talk about in the next program.